Welcome to Velvet Shadows. If this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. We tell the kind of stories that stay with you. And before we begin, drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. We love knowing where our audience is now. Let's get into it. She didn't realize she had already lost until the moment she thought she had finally won. That's the thing about power. The people who actually have it rarely feel the need to announce it. Laurel Ashby walked into the Hargrove Foundation's annual gala that evening, like she had spent 37 years rehearsing for this exact entrance. She wore a champagne-colored gown that caught the chandelier light just so, and she held the arm of Sterling Croft with the particular grip of a woman who has been told, recently and repeatedly, that she had won. Sterling had left his wife. He had moved out of the house on Meridian Hill. He had signed the preliminary separation papers, and tonight was the night Laurel had decided the world would see it. Sterling had tried to slow things down. He'd said something about optics, about timing, about his father-in-law's connections in the room. Laurel had smiled and told him that was exactly why tonight was perfect. The old guard needed to see that Sterling had moved on, that he had chosen someone younger, someone who understood him, someone who didn't spend every dinner talking about legacy and obligation and the weight of the Hargrove name. Sterling had gone quiet after that. Laurel had taken his silence as agreement. She was wrong. What Laurel did not know, what she had never taken the time to find out, was the precise and specific nature of the relationship between Sterling Croft and the Hargrove Foundation. She knew that his wife, Vivienne, came from old money. She knew the Hargroves had a name. But Laurel had spent the last 14 months understanding Sterling through Sterling's eyes, and Sterling had a very particular way of describing his marriage. He described it as a contract, a formality, something that had made sense once and had now simply outlasted its purpose. He never described it as a dynasty. He never mentioned that the Hargrove family had been the primary silent investor behind Croft Capital for 9 of the 11 years. He never mentioned that his office building, the one with the view he talked about constantly, the view that made clients feel like they were sitting on top of the world, was held in a trust administered by Vivienne's older brother, Randall Hargrove. He never mentioned any of that, because to mention it would have required him to say out loud what he had worked very hard to believe was not true, that he had not built anything on his own. Vivienne Hargrove Croft knew all of it. She had always known all of it. She had also known about Laurel for the better part of 9 months. Vivienne was 42 years old, and she had learned a very long time ago that the first response is rarely the right one. Her mother had taught her that. Eleanor Hargrove, her mother, had lived by a principle so simple it sounded passive until you watched her use it. Wait until you understand the full shape of the situation. Only then do you move. So Vivienne had waited. She had gone to dinners with Sterling and smiled and asked him about his day and listened to him answer. She had attended the quarterly review at Croft Capital and shaken hands with people she had known for a decade and said nothing. She had sat across from her brother Randall at Sunday brunch and watched him set down his coffee cup and look at her in a way that asked a question, and she had simply shaken her head just slightly, and he had picked the cup back up and asked about her garden. She had given Sterling 9 months to come to her, to sit down, to say the words that a man with any real courage would have said, to end things honestly, rather than conducting a parallel life and hoping geography would prevent the two halves from ever touching. He had not come to her. He had instead bought Laurel a necklace that Vivienne recognized as coming from the same jeweler where he had, 3 years ago, bought Vivienne her anniversary bracelet. She had seen a photo of it in a text thread that a mutual acquaintance had forwarded to her, not out of cruelty but out of a tired, resigned kind of loyalty. The forwarded message had come with no commentary. It hadn't needed any. After that, Vivienne had made a phone call, one phone call, to Randall. The Hargrove Foundation's annual gala was held every year in the first week of June at the Aldrich Hall, a venue the family had partially endowed in the 1970s. Back when Vivienne's grandfather had decided that if the family was going to write checks to the city, they may as well have a room to put their name on. The gala raised money for arts education programs. It drew 300 guests. It had a wait list. Sterling had attended every year for the past 11 years. This year, he almost hadn't come. He had told Laurel the night before that he was considering skipping it. And she had looked at him across his kitchen counter, the kitchen of his temporary apartment, which still smelled faintly of the real estate agent's staged candles. And she had said very plainly that if he skipped it, people would think he was hiding. Sterling did not like the idea of hiding. Sterling had built an entire identity around being the kind of man who walked into rooms confidently. So he had called his office, confirmed his attendance, and the next evening had put on a tuxedo that Laurel had picked out, slid his arm into hers, and walked into Aldrich Hall. Vivienne arrived 20 minutes later. She had not announced that she was coming. She had been on the guest list, as she always was. The Hargrove name was on the endowment plaque inside the front door. But she had told no one her plans, not Sterling, not her assistant, not even Randall, though he had guessed correctly, because he knew his sister. She wore navy, a simple cut, nothing that demanded attention. She walked in alone and went straight to the table where 3 of the foundation's board members were seated, and she sat down and ordered sparkling water and began talking to them about the upcoming grant cycle, with the same focused attention she brought to everything. The room noticed her. The room always noticed Vivienne Hargrove Croft. But tonight there was a particular quality to the noticing. People glanced toward her table, and then toward the far side of the room, where Sterling stood with Laurel, and then back again. The math was not complicated. Aldrich Hall was not a large room. You could see one end from the other. Sterling saw her first. His face did something complicated. A small collapse quickly rebuilt. He reached for his drink. Laurel didn't see Vivienne until 40 minutes later, when she excused herself from a conversation and turned toward the bar, and found herself standing approximately 8 feet away from the woman, whose marriage she had spent the better part of a year helping to dismantle. Vivienne was not looking at her. Vivienne was looking at the bartender and asking for still water with lemon, in the same tone someone uses to ask for still water with lemon. Ordinary, unhurried. As though nothing in the room was complicated. Laurel stood there for a moment longer than she should have. Then she walked back to Sterling. "She's here," Laurel said. "I know," Sterling said. "You knew?" "I saw her come in." Laurel looked at him. "And you didn't say anything?" Sterling didn't answer that. There is a particular kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, that moves through a room, gathering information, cataloging responses, noting the precise moment when someone reaches for their drink too quickly, or laughs a half-second after everyone else. Vivienne had this kind of intelligence. She had been told growing up that it was the most useful thing a person could cultivate. Not the ability to speak, but the ability to observe. She observed that evening quite a lot. She observed that Sterling's business associate, a man named Philip, who had known Sterling since before Croft Capital existed, came to say hello to her early in the evening and made no mention of Sterling. This was notable because Philip made a point of mentioning Sterling. It was his way of signaling loyalty. The absence of the mention told Vivienne something about how the room was reading the situation. She observed that 2 women she had known socially for years, women who had been to her home for dinner, caught her eye across the room and held it for exactly as long as was necessary to communicate solidarity without requiring words. She observed that Sterling and Laurel had been seated at a table with people who were, without exception, newer relationships. People Sterling had met in the last 3 or 4 years. No one from the old crowd, no one who had been at their wedding. Vivienne did not know if this was intentional or simply how the seating had worked out, but she made a note of it, and she observed the moment around 9 o'clock when Laurel Ashby stood up from her table, raised a glass, and said something. The table laughed, performative laughter, the kind that happens when people are trying to match the energy of whoever initiated it. But the tables around them did not laugh, and the table where Vivienne was seated did not laugh. And the 3 foundation board members at that table, people who had been giving money to this event since before Laurel was old enough to attend it, exchanged a look that contained, without requiring words, an entire conversation. One of them, a woman named Dorothea Marsh, who was 71 years old and had attended this gala for 32 consecutive years, leaned slightly toward Vivienne and said nothing. She simply placed her hand, briefly, on Vivienne's hand. Then she picked up her fork. Vivienne smiled. Not a wounded smile. Not a brave smile. A real one, small and particular, the kind that belongs to a person who knows exactly where they are and exactly what is happening, and has already decided what comes next. Randall Hargrove arrived at 9:15. He had not been on the original attendee list. He had added himself 3 days earlier quietly through the Foundation's administrative office, which was staffed in part by people who had worked for the Hargrove family. Long enough to understand that when Randall Hargrove wanted to attend something, the correct response was to make a place for him. He was 50 years old, silver-haired, and moved through the room the way people move through spaces they are accustomed to owning. Not with arrogance, exactly, but with a specific kind of ease that arrogance cannot fully replicate. He stopped to speak to several people on his way in. He shook hands. He smiled. He took his time, and then he crossed the room to his sister's table, pulled out the empty chair beside her, and sat down. "You look well," he said. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Of course," Randall said. He signaled to a waiter and ordered something. He turned to greet Dorothea Marsh and the other board members and asked about the grant cycle. He asked about the Youth Symphony program and whether they were still having trouble with the space at Jefferson Middle School. He was completely unhurriedly present. Sterling saw him come in. Sterling set down his fork. Laurel noticed the shift in his posture, a tightening, a pulling in. She followed his gaze across the room to where a silver-haired man was now seated at Vivienne's table, leaning forward and apparently discussing something about a school music program with the animation of someone who genuinely cared about school music programs. "Who is that?" Laurel said. Sterling was quiet for a moment. "That's Randall Hargrove," he said. Laurel looked at him. "Vivienne's brother." "Yes. What is he doing here?" Sterling picked up his fork again. He looked at his plate. He said nothing, because the honest answer, the full and complete answer, was something he had spent the last 14 months avoiding. He had never explained to Laurel the specific architecture of his financial life. He had let her believe that Croft Capital was his, purely and entirely in the way she wanted it to be. A monument to his intelligence and ambition. He had let her believe this because he had also spent 11 years letting himself believe it. The honest answer was that Randall Hargrove, being in this room, at this table, with that posture and that ease, meant something that Sterling did not want to translate aloud. So he said, "I don't know," and they both knew it wasn't true. At 9:47, Randall leaned across the table and said something quietly to his sister. Vivienne listened, nodded once, and they both stood. The room noticed. That is the thing about presence, real presence, not performed presence. When someone who occupies that particular quality of space stands up and begins moving through a room, the room responds in a way it cannot help. Conversations paused. Heads turned, not with dramatic effect, but with the organing to something significant. Randall and Vivienne crossed the room, together, side by side, in no hurry. They stopped at Sterling's table. Randall looked at Sterling with an expression that contained impressively almost nothing. Not anger, not contempt, not satisfaction. It was the expression of a man conducting a routine review of a situation he had already fully assessed. "Sterling," he said. "Randall," Sterling said. His voice was steady. He had a good voice for this kind of moment, trained by years of client meetings and difficult conversations. But his hands, Vivienne noticed, had come off the table. Vivienne looked at Laurel. Laurel looked back. The moment between them lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds something was communicated that could not be unsaid. Not a threat, not a triumph, something more like clarity, the simple, devastating clarity of a woman who has already done everything she needed to do. "I want to congratulate you both," Vivienne said. Her voice was level, the way water is level. "It takes real courage to announce something in a room like this." Laurel opened her mouth, closed it. "I wanted to come say hello," Vivienne continued. "It seemed important." given everything. Sterling said nothing. He was looking at the table. Randall wanted to speak with you before the end of the evening, Vivienne said, glancing at her brother. About Croft Capital. I imagine you know why. The word Croft Capital landing in this room, at this table with Randall standing there. Sterling felt it somewhere in his chest, like a door closing, like something being filed. Randall said, simply, my office will reach out Monday morning. It's not urgent tonight. He paused. Enjoy the rest of your evening. And then they turned, both of them, with the same unhurried ease with which they had arrived, and walked back across the room. What happened Monday morning was not dramatic. There were no raised voices. There was a phone call, and then a meeting, and then a series of documents, and then another meeting with lawyers. The Hargrove family's stake in Croft Capital, which Sterling had spent 11 years referring to as a legacy partnership in his own mind, never saying it out loud, never giving it its full name, was reviewed, assessed, and restructured. Sterling's attorney told him that technically they had grounds to argue, that technically the arrangement was not as absolute as Sterling feared. Technically, Sterling had sat in his apartment in the kitchen that smelled of staged candles and looked at the wall for a while. He thought about all the times he had described his marriage as a contract, a formality, something that had outlasted its purpose. He thought about the view from his office, the view that made clients feel like they were sitting on top of the world, the view from a building held in a trust administered by the man who had looked at him across a table and said, with perfect calm, my office will reach out Monday morning. He thought about the way Vivienne had looked at him, not with anger, not with hurt exactly, or rather not with fresh hurt, the raw kind, with the settled, distant expression of someone who had already moved through the grief stage of something and arrived at the other side. He thought about what Laurel had said when he'd told her what was happening. She had sat across from him and she had said, I didn't know it was that complicated. And he had looked at her and understood, with a clarity he would have preferred not to have, that she had loved him in the way you love something you have misunderstood. That her love had been for a version of him that was not entirely true, that she had fallen for the story he told about himself, not for the actual geography of his life. He thought about a lot of things. Vivienne spent the weekend after the gala at her mother's house in Connecticut. Eleanor was 74 years old and had the same quality her daughter had, that watchful, unhurried stillness, but warmer now, softened by age, and the particular wisdom of someone who had seen enough outcomes to stop worrying about whether they were coming. They had breakfast on the porch. Eleanor poured coffee and handed her daughter a cup and did not ask any questions. After a while, Vivienne said, I think I handled it the right way. Eleanor considered this. How did you handle it? I let it run its course. I didn't say anything I didn't need to say. I waited until the shape of it was clear. And now? And now, Randall's office is handling the business side, and I've spoken to Robert. Robert was her attorney. The separation will be civil. Sterling isn't a bad person. She paused. He's just not a brave one. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the bravest thing about you is that you never confuse the two. Vivienne turned her coffee cup slowly in her hand. Outside, a bird was doing something persistent in the garden. The morning was cool, the kind of cool's like a promise. The woman, Eleanor said. Not a question. Laurel, Vivienne said. She's fine, she didn't know the full picture. No, Eleanor said. They rarely do. She picked up her cup. He let her believe a version of his life that was easier for him. That's not her fault. Vivienne nodded. She had already arrived at this on her own some months ago. You cannot blame someone for navigating a map they were given incorrectly. Are you sad? Eleanor asked. Vivienne thought about this. Yes, she said, but not in the way I expected to be. More like closing a chapter you knew had to end. You're sad it's over, but you understand that it was going to end. She looked at the garden. 11 years is a long time to understand someone, and to forgive them, Eleanor said. I haven't forgiven him yet, Vivienne said, but I think I will. Eleanor nodded, as if this was exactly the right answer. And then she asked if Vivienne wanted more coffee, and Vivienne said yes, and the morning continued the way mornings do. Forward, quietly, without requiring permission. There is a lesson the Aldrich Hall Gala did not forget. Not that year, and not in the years that followed, when the stories circulated in the way stories circulate in a city, where everyone knows everyone who matters. It circulated not as gossip exactly, but as a kind of cautionary education. The kind people return to when trying to explain something to someone younger who is about to make a mistake. The lesson was not about betrayal. Everyone already knew about betrayal. The lesson was about what it means to mistake a person for something smaller than they are. Sterling Croft had looked at his wife and seen a formality. He had looked at his marriage and seen a contract. He had looked at his life and narrated it in a way that made his choices seem inevitable. His circumstance seemed like his own creation. His success seemed like a product of his own vision and work, when in fact he had been operating inside a structure built, in significant part, by the family of the woman he had decided to leave. He had not understood that he was not walking away from a wife. He was walking away from the architecture that had held his entire life in place. And by the time he understood that, by the time the shape of it became undeniable, he was already sitting in a room full of people who understood it before he did. A room that had watched a silver-haired man walk across a floor with unhurried certainty, and say, with the simple economy of someone who never needed to raise his voice, "My office will out." The room understood. The room had understood before he said a word. That, in the end, was the thing about power. The people who actually have it never announce it. They don't have to. The room already knows. And the gala, that particular June evening under those particular chandeliers, became the kind of story people told. Not to be cruel, but to be honest. To remind themselves and each other that the version of a life someone tells you about is never the entire map. That behind every confident man who believes he has built something entirely his own, there is usually a more complicated truth. That patience is not passivity. That silence is not weakness. And that some women, the kind who have been watching and waiting and understanding the full shape of the situation, are never actually losing. They are just waiting for the right room.